So hi, everyone. Thanks for being here today to this later fall IRCSF event. So today we're very excited to have Miray Philips. Miray, come into the camera so everyone can see you. Miray Philips from the University of Toronto, who's the new Sociology of Religion hire at U of T, which is exciting. That one, there was a Sociology of Religion hire, and two, that they hired you. It's really exciting. So thanks for being here. And as usual, we've got an online crowd, we've got an in-person crowd, so bear with us as we manage the hybrid aspect of this event. But for those of you who are online, the chat is open, so you're welcome to use that throughout the talk. Miray will talk for about half an hour. Is that 40 minutes? That's fine, for about 40 minutes. And so we ask that you remain muted while Miray's giving her talk. And then we'll have a Q&A where we'll open it up, and so people can ask questions either here in the room or on Zoom. And like I mentioned, if you didn't notice already, we're recording the event, just so you're aware. And yeah, okay. So I think without further ado, I will share the screen to get Miray's slides, and then I'll pass the mic over to you. Okay. So there we go. And we'll put her into presentation mode. Okay. And then we'll just make sure she's working. It's working. Okay. So over to you.
Thank you all for coming online and in person, and thank you, Gavin and Sarah and Carol, for this invitation. And it's quite exciting to learn about the Institute and just be here. So today's presentation is on the transnational politics of Christian persecution. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about how religious freedom advocates in the United States appropriate the persecution of Christians in the Middle East, and how they claim to do that under this banner of a global attack against Christians. This is part of a broader book project about contested definitions of religious difference and advocacy on behalf of religious minorities in the Middle East. But a little bit of background. So in Egypt, the Christian population, or Copts, Coptic Egyptian Christians, make up about 10% of the population, which is around 10 million people. Copts are the biggest ethno-religious group within Egypt and the largest Christian minority group in the Middle East. Copts are generally marginalized in Egypt at every level, from everyday discrimination to state-sanctioned violence. But over the past decade, they've experienced a brutal wave of violence, particularly at the hands of ISIS, prompting the Coptic Church to declare this an era of martyrs. So this particular moment, the past 10 years, the past decade, Copts have been experiencing a particularly brutal wave of massacres, prompting the Coptic Church to label this as a modern-day Coptic era of martyrs. But one particular incident stands out, where in 2015, ISIS kidnapped 20 Coptic Egyptians and a Ghanaian and beheaded them on a beach in Libya. And this is a still of the video. So ISIS produced this exceptionally well-produced video of this beheading and broadcasted it to the world. And this video, which this is a still of, sent shockwaves amongst Copts and Egyptians more broadly. So this incident unfolded against this backdrop where ISIS was on the rise across the Middle East, and they had committed what became recognized as a genocide against the Yazidis and Christian religious minorities in Iraq and Syria. This is also a moment in which authoritarianism is also on the rise, and there's a new regional and global politics of the war on terror. So the incident wasn't just meaningful for Copts or Egyptians, but it resonated globally. At an event in Washington, D.C., Nina Shea, a Christian religious freedom advocate at the conservative Hudson Institute, described the 21 as the face of Christian persecution globally. In DC, the stories and imagery of the 21 became central in this Christian persecution or international religious freedom advocacy. So we see here an image created by Open Doors International, which is a Christian missionary organization that works on the suffering of Christians globally. The woman in the image is a widow of one of the martyrs. The N stands for Nasara, which means Christians in Arabic. And this was, ISIS would spray paint the N on the homes of Christians in Iraq and Syria before attacking them. So many amongst the Christian right globally, not just in the US, started adopting this symbol as a symbol of Christian persecution. And finally, the poster reads that 215 million Christians experience high levels of persecution worldwide, which is based on the data that Open Doors themselves collects and shares about the gravity of Christian persecution. So religious freedom actors in the US drew on this imagery and these stories of persecution in the Middle East to talk about a global war on Christianity. Though a small and somewhat apolitical diaspora, Copts are known to American politicians because their persecution in Egypt figures centrally in this religious freedom advocacy. And Copts themselves largely vote Republican and support President Trump, in part because he has vowed to protect Christians in the Middle East. So in the most recent elections, Trump tweeted at the Coptic community to vote for him, saying, "To the Coptic Christian community living throughout the United States, I deeply admire your steadfast faith in God, perseverance through centuries of persecution, and love for this great country. I'm counting on your support and vote to help uphold our shared social and family values and continue to make America great again." Here he appeals to their Christianity, their persecution, and connects with them over shared conservative social and family values. Indeed, Copts are significant for American advocates who work on US foreign policy, partially because they represent the largest Christian community in the Middle East, and because Egypt continues to be strategically significant in the fight against terrorism and in maintaining the hegemony of Israel in the region. But as I'll show throughout the presentation, the suffering of Christians in the Middle East figures prominently in this activism around Christian persecution in the US. But it doesn't just simply impact how these advocates shape US foreign policy on the Middle East, but it has local implications in a context in which Christianity is increasingly being experienced as one that's marginalized, or that there's a lot of domestic anxieties about the place of Christianity in the US. So in this presentation, I am specifically asking, how do these international religious freedom actors frame and localize? So how do they understand Middle Eastern Christianity, the persecution of Middle Eastern Christians, but also how do they localize it within a domestic US context? So sociologists of religion have attended to perceptions of persecution amongst the American religious right domestic. But this presentation tries to argue that this process, or the way Americans understand their persecution, is very much a transnational process. In many ways, sociology of religion can benefit from interdisciplinary scholarship on religion. So from sociology of religion, we understand how conservative American Christians are increasingly feeling that their way of life is under attack. They react to these concerns by adopting conservative sociopolitical attitudes, including ideas about Christian nationalism. And Christian nationalists, and they advance religious freedom for Christians in particular, all while promoting or supporting anti-Semitic, anti-theistic, and Islamophobic attitudes. This has led to religious freedom becoming a deeply polarizing topic in the US today, where religious freedom has become a proxy for conservative family values, entrenching this principle into American culture wars. And Christian religious freedom has become leveraged against the rights of gender and sexual minorities. But turning to this interdisciplinary scholarship on religion, particularly from religious studies, history, and international affairs, allows us to situate some of these domestic anxieties within a global context. So while evangelical Christians have been actively involved in domestic civic reform since at least the 19th century, it wasn't until the 1970s that evangelical Christians started tuning into the suffering of Christians worldwide, globally. The anti-Christian persecution movement largely gained momentum during the Cold War and framed communism and Islam as the primary threats to Christianity globally. By the 1990s, advocates started turning to the political sphere to institutionalize religious freedom in US foreign policy. So while Christians remained a key population of concern, the movement did expand its advocacy to other religious groups as well. So to chart how Christian persecution, or to map out how Christian persecution is understood, is constructed through a transnational process, I turn to the literature on global memory cultures and how violent events are remembered and represented transnationally. So much of this literature is concerned with how memory is formed at the intersection of the local, national, and transnational and global. And it recognizes that transnational memories aren't just superimposed from one context to another. So the way that Christian persecution in the Middle East is framed and understood, for example, does not travel to the US without being transformed, and it is transformed. It interacts with, the unique local context, producing unique messages, memories, and memorializations in politics about what Christian persecution means. In American foreign politics in particular, foreign events are imported to either legitimate American policy, confirm American ethos, values, and ways of life, or events are made American through appropriation. So as we'll come to see, these imported events, foreign events of Christian persecution in the Middle East, come to legitimate American policy on the war on terror that confirms American values of religious freedom. And for these advocates in particular, a focus on Christian religious freedom in particular. And Christian persecution is localized in America to discuss a domestic war on Christians. So there's various reasons how, or ways that this transnational transmission occurs. Media plays a large role. So media has brought images and stories of atrocities to people across the globe. And it allows people to empathize and connect with the suffering of people elsewhere. And within this context in particular, ISIS was particularly skilled in the way that they produced and broadcasted their videos of violence. And this allowed other Christians globally to learn about their suffering. Transnational networks of memory also play a major role in the transmission of memory. And these transnational networks of memory can include diaspora groups or global religious communities or international organizations. And in this context, religious freedom actors belong to a shared religious community formed around a sense of Christian kinship. So even though they themselves are not directly members of the victim groups of Middle Eastern Christians, they are some of their loudest advocates and connect with them over a shared Christian identity. Lastly, the meaning of atrocity has become abstract, meaning they no longer focus on the specifics of that atrocity, but instead become representations of universal problems. So much of that scholarship has looked at the universalization of the Holocaust or of human rights as a universal principle. But again, Christian persecution can be abstracted because Christianity itself is rooted in a belief in everlasting suffering, and this transcends local communities. And since Christianity is a global religion, atrocities against its people can be transformed into a collective injury. So ultimately, this project allows us to focus on transnational networks of memory and the specific role of religious groups and the idea of Christian kinship. And it also allows us to examine why Christian persecution in particular is effective in being transmitted, politicized, and localized in US domestic politics. So I am interested in international religious freedom advocates and their advocacy on behalf of Christians in the Middle East. So I did my field work in Washington, D.C. for over 15 months of, I conducted an ethnography where I attended advocacy events, meetings on the Hill, vigils, closed meetings with international religious freedom advocates. I also interviewed around 30 people and conducted and collected documents, either policy documents or organizational documents. I did this field work between 2019 and 2020, which was particularly relevant because it overlapped with Trump's presidency, whose administration really gave a platform to religious freedom advocacy and advocacy on behalf of Christians. And this time period also came right after this brutal decade that Christians faced in the Middle East. So the advocacy space in DC was especially concerned with the suffering of Middle East Christians. To give you a sense of who these actors are, or what this international religious freedom field looks like. There is a long history of US intervention on behalf of religion, but it only became institutionalized in US foreign policy fairly recently. In the mid-20th century, evangelicals turned their attention to the persecution of Christians globally, connecting with their suffering as part of a persecuted body of Christ. Criticisms of Christian favoritism led this group to broaden their scope, shifting their language away from the narrow focus of Christian persecution to the legal framework of religious freedom. And this went from just a focus on Christians to a focus on all religious and non-religious communities. And eventually, and to do so, evangelicals worked with other religious groups, including Tibetan Buddhists, Catholics, Jews, as well as congressmen, to pass the International Religious Freedom Act in 1998. And this officially institutionalized religious freedom in US foreign policy. So though the movement today advocates on behalf of a variety of religious and non-religious communities, and though the movement today looks very different in that it's not just evangelicals or just Christians, it's expanded quite a bit. A scholar, Batiza, argues that the movement still has a soft spot for Christians. And this is for a variety of different reasons. One is that the movement has its roots in Protestant ideas about what constitutes religion. Many of the advocates themselves are Christians, so have an affinity towards the other Christian kin. And religious freedom has become highly politicized and rooted in domestic culture. And this I can expand on later too. So I did my field work amongst a variety of different organizations that worked on religious freedom. To give you an example, In Defense of Christians worked on just Christians in the Middle East. The Religious Freedom Institute was an institute that worked on religious freedom both domestically and internationally in all religious and non-religious communities. And the Hudson Institute had a broad focus, but religious freedom was only one part of the kind of work that they did. Politically, the field of international religious freedom ranges from far-right Christians to center-leaning liberals. And again, as we see here, some focused on just Christians, some focused on other communities, some focused on just international issues, some focused on both domestic and international. So rather than just exploring one organization in particular, I did take this field approach to look at how organizations compete and collaborate in defining what is and advocating on behalf of Christians in the Middle East. So when it comes to the plight of Christians in the Middle East, these advocates frame the problem as a matter of Christian persecution. This framing places an emphasis that this group of people is being targeted for their religion, making this a question of religious freedom, for example, rather than citizenship rights or minority rights or human rights. And how these groups frame this problem shapes then how they act upon it. So when advocates specifically frame the problem as a matter of Christian persecution, they're selective in their framing, and this is facilitated by a sense of Christian kinship. So after ISIS beheaded the 21, a German author, Martin Mosbach, traveled to Egypt to meet with the families of the martyrs. He wrote this book on the 21, and then he was later invited by the Religious Freedom Institute in Washington, D.C. to discuss this book. So on the right, you see Martin Mosbach, and on the left, you see Kent Hill, who's a co-founder of the Religious Freedom Institute and a senior fellow in Middle East and Islam. And on stage, and notably, they're both Catholic. And on stage, they engage in this exchange about the martyrs that Martin encountered. So and they talk about them as authentic martyrs, as authentic Christians. So Kent Hill starts by saying, if you're steeped in a 3-hour liturgy, that's utterly otherworldly, which these young men seem to have been. They really are a testimony to another world that most who call themselves religious in the West may not be such a vibrant testimony. Martin Mosbach pushes back a little bit and says, I'm far from idealizing the Coptic world, but people in Cairo told me you will not find the real Copt in Cairo or Alexandria, but you will find them in Upper Egypt, the mainland of Copts, and there you will find our religion in the highest state of power. So this exchange draws on various tropes about the Middle East and its Christians. They draw on the trope of the Middle East being a distant and mythical, otherworldly location. They describe Christians as a people who participate in lengthy traditions, and this is meant to resemble the depth of religiosity and the authenticity of Christianity. And this is contrasted with Christianity in the West. And they talk about Christianity being especially authentic in Upper Egypt, so in rural Egypt. And here they're drawing on a popular discourse of urban Egyptians as different because they're particularly able to endure spiritual hardship. But even in the past, Christian missionaries often framed these urban Egyptians as static relics of both a biblical and pharaonic past. So here they're really describing or painting an image of these Copts as the most authentic of Christians. So these tropes are part of this process of turning these ordinary people into exceptional martyrs, overlooking the nuances of their life in favor of presenting them as quintessential, authentic, contemporary martyrs. And this martyrdom can only emerge out of the context of the Middle East. And this is an example of what Melanie McAllister terms enchanted internationalism, where American Christians are longing for powerful, emotional, religious experiences that are often associated with Christians in the global South. And this is in contrast to how Americans experience religion as dry or disenchanted in the West. So these authentic martyrs are not just people that need to be saved, but people that need to be emulated. So if Christians in the Middle East represent authentic Christianity, the Middle East itself has broader significance as the place from which Christianity emerged. So during the first Trump presidency from 2017 to 2021, his administration vowed to protect Christians in the Middle East. This was at the height of ISIS defeat of the region. The US had just declared this a genocide, and this administration had poured in a lot of effort into saving Christians in the Middle East. So reflecting on this idea of the Middle East being the birthplace of Christianity, at an In Defense of Christians conference in 2017, Mike Pence, the VP at the time, spoke about the symbolic connection. He says, Christianity is under unprecedented assault in those ancient lands where it first, in the mountains of Syria, the valleys of Lebanon, on the plains of Nineveh, the plateaus of Armenia, on the banks of Tigris and Euphrates, the delta of the Nile, the fathers and mothers of our faith planted seeds of belief. But now that garden of faith is under threat. Many of the Christian communities that first embraced the message of Christ are today the targets of unspeakable acts of violence and atrocity. So here he's evoking an investment in what's going on in the Middle East, not simply because they're suffering Christians, but because these communities represent the foundations and the origins of Christianity. So he continues with this frame, and by framing this issue as a matter of Christians versus Muslims. He says, let me assure you tonight, President Trump and I see these crimes for what they are. Vile acts of persecution animated by hatred for Christians and the gospel of Christ. And so too does this president know who and what has perpetrated these crimes, and he calls them by their name, radical Islamic terrorists. So this frame does resonate with the domestic audience, especially after 9/11, which saw Islamic terrorism as the ultimate enemy. Here, Christians in the Middle East come to resemble the quintessential victims of this enemy. And in framing the problem of persecution in the Middle East, these actors primarily rely on this religious framing. They identify the victims by their religion as Christians. They frame the violence as a matter of religious terrorist violence driven by hatred. They identify the perpetrators by their religion as Muslim. And ultimately, this framing is quite selective in that it ignores the complex identity of Christians and their relationship to their national homelands. It reduces Muslim-Christian relationships to a simplified, ahistoric argument about age-old hatreds between religious communities. And it focuses on Islamic terrorism as a primary problem facing Christians absolving authoritarian regimes. In fact, many leaders of the international religious freedom movement often built strong ties with authoritarian regimes in the Middle East. In this image, we see Tony Perkins and Johnny Moore, both evangelical leaders who held key positions in the US Commission on International Religious Freedom, meeting with President Sisi as part of an evangelical delegation. This is the Egyptian president. These meetings often reaffirmed a widely held belief that authoritarian regimes were better for religious minorities than the alternative of political Islam or terrorism. International religious freedom actors played a significant role in appeasing these regimes in the Middle East in the name of protecting Christian minorities. And this is part of a global and regional politics of the war on terror, where authoritarian regimes in the Middle East, such as President Sisi, portrays himself as a savior of Christians by advancing religious freedom in the name of countering terrorism, when in fact so much of these claims has served as a pretense to conduct massive human rights violations against civil society and any dissenters in Egypt. These politics are not just so unique to Republican policies or even the Trump administration. The US has historically supported autocratic regimes, seeing them as possibly more stable, but mostly finding allies among them in their fight against terrorism. So these alliances between these international religious freedom advocates and authoritarian regimes absolved authoritarian regimes from their role in marginalizing and failing to protect their religious minorities. So international religious freedom advocates constructed the problem of Christian persecution through this framework of religion, identifying strongly with the region both as a birthplace of Christianity. And this shapes how they engaged in US foreign policy. So if they frame the victims as Christians, the perpetrators as Muslim, the nature of the conflict as stemming from religious hatred, then they also frame their responsibility to intervene through the lens of religion, arguing that the US had a particular responsibility because it was a Christian nation. So this is a quote by Peter Burns, the advocacy director of In Defense of Christians, and he says, Christian communities don't have a voice in the region. Shia communities have Iran to support them, and Sunnis have Saudi Arabia, but Christians don't have anyone. In the US, protecting religious freedom is a core human rights value. So here he's doing a couple things. First, he's emphasizing that solidarity in the region occurs across religious lines. So he's painting an image of the Middle East as inherently and fundamentally sectarian. And he's implying that Christians in the Middle East look to the US because it's a Christian nation. He's also drawing on a collective memory of the US as one founded on the idea or the principle of religious freedom, and therefore argues that the US has a particular role in protecting these Christians. So these advocates frame the victims as Christians and themselves as saviors based on a sense of Christian kinship. So though they do that in their framing, this is actually a very fraught category, a fraught relationship in the way that conservatives and the Republican administration deals with and engages with Middle Eastern Christians. And this too is something that we can talk more about in the Q&A, especially how they engage with them, for example, as immigrants in the US, how they engage with the Palestinian question, but mostly Christians or Middle East Christians challenge a racial and religious hierarchy. So we've talked about how they frame Christian persecution in the Middle East as a question of religion, but now we'll talk about how they localize Christian persecution and how it resonates within domestic contexts. So part of this sense of anxiety is a reflection of how American Christians are also believe that they're also suffering. And here they draw on the Christian persecution that's happening overseas and localize it too. So this is a Fox News headline stating that Christian persecution not just happening overseas, many in the US targeted for their faith too. So they extrapolate the suffering of Christians elsewhere and localize it domestically. And again, this is what scholar Melanie McAllister identifies as victim identification, where American Christians are engaged and advocating on behalf of Christians in the global South, and it allows them to see themselves as part of a globally persecuted group, and they then make claims about their persecution domestically. So international religious freedom advocates often use this discourse in their programming to claim that they are also suffering. Every year, the Family Research Council hosts the Values Voter Summit, which is a political conference for conservatives. You'll see here Tony Perkins again, who we met in an earlier photo standing beside President Sisi. And he's the founder of the Family Research Council, and for several years he was also the commissioner and then became the chair of the US Commission on International Religious Freedom. The Family Research Council largely works on domestic issues, promoting family values, from Christian religious freedom to anti-abortion legislation. They've advocated against the gender ideology, and they've been characterized by the Southern Poverty Law Center as a hate group for their anti-LGBTQ laws. So I attended the summit in 2019 where Trump was the keynote speaker, and one of the main invitees was Andrew Brunson. Andrew Brunson was an evangelical pastor based in Turkey. He was arrested in 2016 and accused of terrorism and espionage. And the international religious freedom community really rallied around his arrest until he was released in 2019. He came to represent persecution in the Middle East, the importance of evangelizing in the Muslim world, and the power of prayer. Notably for evangelicals, one of the key categories of Christians who are persecuted are those who are evangelizing. And so Pastor Brunson became a modern day example of this kind of persecution. So during an exchange on stage between Tony Perkins and Andrew Brunson, Tony asks him what his message is to the 280 million Christians in the world suffering persecution. So he talks about the US context. I think there's increasing pressure coming in the States. So one thing is to be aware that persecution can happen. It has happened throughout history. It is actually the normal thing in many cultures. And to be aware that this can happen to us and begin now to make decisions. There's this growing sense amongst many conservative Christians that Christian persecution is coming to the US, but that it's inevitably coming. And of course, this sense of persecution is quite tied into mobilization and advocacy on the question of abortion, schools, and it plays a role in the political rhetoric today. Secularism is blamed for this problem of persecution. So in the event with Martin Mosbach, the German author, who we encountered earlier, Kent Hill talks about the problem of secularism. He says, at a time when parts of the Christian world, even in the West right now, are beginning to face more discrimination, in some cases persecution, what do these Coptic martyrs have to teach us today and during this time of the rise in the West, at least of a more militant form of a kind of fundamentalist secularism? So here he's evoking a sense of anxiety about the place of Christianity, the threat of a militant form of a kind of fundamentalist secularism, but he's also drawing on these authentic martyrs as exemplars to teach Christians about how to face this inevitability of Christian persecution. And again, it's important to note that the Religious Freedom Institute, like others, work on domestic issues And they've been actually quite involved in legal cases around religious freedom and around sex and gender. In one extreme political example, the day before the Capitol insurrection on January 6, 2020, Eric Metaxas, who's an author and radio personality and a Trump supporter, posted the following tweet with an image of the 21 martyrs with the caption, "What price are you willing to pay for what you believe in?" Again, he evokes the persecution of Christians in the Middle East to incite his supporters to respond to election results and interprets it as a form of religious political persecution. Effectively, he's comparing the state of Christians in the US to the persecution of Christians in the Middle East, comparing attacks by ISIS to the perceived to attacks against Trump and losing the US election. So the localization of Christian persecution directly plays into ongoing domestic wars about the place of Christianity. So to bring this to some kind of close, I did set out trying to understand how international religious freedom actors frame and localize Middle Eastern Christian persecution for political gain in the US. And the following key factors are central to this transnational process. There's a sense of shared identity. So international religious freedom actors play a role in transmitting this memory from the Middle East to the US. They mobilize around a sense of shared Christian kinship, and they build this affinity with Middle East Christians around this shared religious identity. There's a sense of selective framing in that they frame this issue as a matter of religion. They define the victims as Christians, the perpetrators as Muslims, the nature of the violence as one of religious hatred, and they ultimately define their own responsibility as Christians in a Christian nation. And this fits aptly within the context of the war on terror, which frames the problem of Christian persecution as a matter of terrorism, absolving other factors and reducing complex political, social, cultural factors to a question of religion. They also abstract the atrocity. So whereas Christian persecution, or within Egypt in particular, unfolds within a context of, in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, within a context of the rise of authoritarianism, within a local context of particular terrorist groups emerging, this becomes flattened and abstracted when you're talking about a Christian group, and it connects it to a sense of eternal Christian suffering that's not localized but abstracted. And ultimately, there's an instrumental benefit here too. This affinity with Christians serves a political benefit for these international religious freedom advocates, where they can then localize the suffering to make claims about their own inevitable persecution in the US. So in many ways, this process of appropriating the suffering of others through a shared identity and these other factors are not unique to this group in particular. But this does tell us something about how this belief that Christianity is under attack is very much a transnational process. That to understand, that it's difficult to understand domestic anxieties about Christian persecution without putting it in a global context. So this belief that Christianity is under attack in America is framed as part of a global war on Christians. Positioning American Christians simultaneously as advocates for suffering kin as well as victims of Christian persecution. And conservative American Christians believe that Christianity is under attack domestically due to its declining hegemony and the rise of secularism, and internationally due to the perceived threat of communism and Islam. And specifically by claiming that there is a global war on Christians, conservative American Christians localize the suffering of Christians globally to claim that they're persecuted domestically. So this ability to extend the suffering of Christians from the global to the local allows them to claim victimhood, turning persecution into a powerful political tool in legal battles and culture wars domestically. And so the suffering of Christians abroad is not simply a communal matter that matters only for Copts or only for Egypt, but has become meaningful in the United States through this global Christian kinship that has in turn has implications for domestic, which in turn has domestic political ramifications. So in this sense, Christian persecution is constructed as a global problem and localized in a domestic context where Christianity is increasingly experienced, where Christians increasingly experience domestic anxieties. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Miray. Oh, wow, fascinating stuff. Okay, I think some of us, at least if not all, have lots of questions. Okay, so just to let everyone know how we're moving now into the Q&A portion of the event. And so just to kind of have a sense of how it will work. So for those of you online, you can raise your virtual hand if you have a question for Miray. You can, if you prefer, you'd rather us read it out, you can post your question in the chat. Caroline's going to keep an eye on the chat for us. And of course, for those of you in the room, you can just raise your hand if you have a question, and I'll walk over with the tiny microphone so that everyone can hear you. So, we're fine. So we're not changing it now, Galen. Okay, so who wants to get us started on the questions? Oh, okay, hang on. Well, okay, I'll bring the mic to Caroline. She's got a question in the chat.
Okay, in the chat, Stephen Marcos, untangling real persecution of Christians outside the US and domestic hijacking of this for political reasons must be quite difficult. Where would you consider the start to be?
I guess the start is that the book became a book to map out some of these contested framings that I think I set out. I think part of this work of untangling is to understand who's putting out narratives around Christian persecution, whose narratives are enduring, who has political power to define how we understand Christian persecution, and then how it plays out in a context in which there's a way in which Copts are actually minuscule, or that they are actually objects of something else. So here I talked so much about how they are a tool in global politics on the war on terror, or they're instrumentalized by certain actors. So I think part of this untangling for me is to actually just sit down and map out who are the actors making some of these claims. The broader book doesn't just look at American Christians or international religious freedom actors, but it also looks at the Coptic Church, the Egyptian government, Coptic diaspora advocates themselves, and the human rights community that emerges out of Egypt that's more concerned with human rights and less concerned with religious freedom in particular. So to me, that was not the start, but eventually where I landed is to just try to untangle some of these narratives to just untangle it and map it out. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I have a bunch of questions. This is great, Miray. Thank you so much. But maybe just to follow up on that, I mean, one question I was thinking about is, are there examples of groups, organizations drawing attention to the persecution of Copts that are not right-wing Christian groups? So, I mean, I don't know, progressive Christians or maybe just secular human rights groups. And I'm curious then, like, what, if there are examples of that, you know, what do you see those as being more effective? Why are they more effective? And yeah, I guess sort of thinking about what alternative frames exist. Yeah, for this.
Excellent. Thank you for that question. Yes. So one thing I realized really quickly while I was doing my field work is how separate some of these groups were. So the world in which international religious freedom advocates are working on Christians in the Middle East and using the religious freedom framework is so detached from ongoing advocacy on Egypt and the human rights question. So when I think a year into my field work, became really perplexed as to why you have these Christian American, mostly white advocates. Why are they not even working with or referring back to or using the expertise of other advocates who are experts on Egypt and know quite a lot on the Coptic question? So there is this sense of polarization that happens in Washington, D.C., but these are also polarized frameworks. So you do have human rights actors. These are actors who are largely exiled from Egypt, who landed in the US. You're talking, and I don't do a good job of giving you the picture of what's going on in Egypt, but Egypt is a country that's really suffering, that has an authoritarian leader, and its human rights are in shambles. And this is an authoritarian leader who is coming after the human rights space. And he's also an authoritarian leader that covers up his human rights violations by saying that he's a religious freedom advocate. So you can't come after me for violating human rights because, look, I'm building churches and I'm doing so well saving Christians in the Middle East. And this is kind of the politics of religious freedom. So you have this group who are leaving Egypt and leaving this context where religious freedom is being pitted against human rights, where religious freedom is being used to justify human rights violations. And you have a Coptic population who originally were very much Sisi supporters, and over the years started struggling with the variety of things one struggles with under an authoritarian regimes like their Muslim counterparts. This is kind of some of the background. So what this group then, the way they advocate on behalf of Christians is that they don't talk, is that they abstract it, or that they use Christians as a way into some of their advocacy in Washington. So they'll, for example, walk into a Republican office that's very concerned with Christians in the Middle East and terrorism, etc., and they'll be like, well, Christians, like Muslims, are suffering from economic conditions. Christian human rights advocates, like their Muslim counterparts, are being incarcerated. And so they'll flip, they'll use a very different framework to look at how Christians are suffering under an authoritarian regime. This is some of what I was alluding to about like the apps, what is the alternative? But it's this question around framing what's going on with Christians, not as a question of Muslim-Christian hatred, but as a question of state-sanctioned violence and institutionalized legal discrimination. And that's what a human rights framework offers by these actors who are particularly coming from a context of human rights violations. But it's not an enduring, it's not a powerful narrative.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. And wait, oh yeah, she's got a mic on. I realized I was like, should I
yes, you
know. I guess just do you think that that's a sufficient framing to sort of get at the, I mean, in the case of the 21, it was ISIS.
Yes.
Which, you know, I guess you could say was authoritarian, but really it was this rogue group, right, doing its own thing. And so is there a way to draw attention to that kind of violation of human rights? Because you know what I mean with that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. So the 21 are initially labor migrants who left Egypt because they couldn't find, work opportunities, and that's why they left to Libya. So you can understand them as Christians. You can understand them as labor migrants who don't have work opportunities. When they were first kidnapped, the families alerted the Egyptian government, who ignored it until this video was released and it became public outcry, and then intervened. The Egyptian government then attacked what they declared were Libyan terrorist bases. Really, I think, irking many people, wondering why would they attack after this video was released and not actually engage prior when there was knowledge of them being alive and kidnapped? So this is like some of the politics around how you can, the enduring narrative is that these are religious martyrs, rogue terrorist organization, etc. But there's quite a lot of details that also implicate the state in not protecting their minorities. There are other examples in which the state itself perpetrated violence against Christians. There's a Mosquito massacre where the Egyptian security forces killed 28 Copts protesting the demolition of a church. And then there's another incident that happened right before the Egyptian revolution where the Interior Ministry was involved in a bomb attack that they then blamed on terrorists. And it wasn't until years later that it was discovered that it was the Interior Ministry itself that was involved in doing that. So there's an enduring narrative, and then there's ways that you can understand and implicate the state in failing to protect it. Yeah, I appreciate those questions because I think they like really, I'm alluding to what else there is, but this helps me kind of just describe that. Yeah.
Oh, so if no one else wants to go, I have a question. So thanks so much, Miray. Great talk. So myself and Catalina and Yashika, who was here for part of the talk, we're actually kind of visiting some of the Christian nationalism literature coming from the States, right? The Perry and Whitehead, that whole body of literature.
Yes.
And so I was kind of wondering where you see this fitting or not fitting within that discussion, and that kind of, the concept of Christian nationalism as they're defining it, kind of tied to heteronormativity, to white nationalism, to anti-immigrant sentiment often. And so do you kind of see this as at least the kind of Christian persecution narrative coming from the US as part of that or not? What are your feelings on that body of literature?
I think I would do a disservice to the international religious freedom field if I were to characterize them as entirely right-wing, entirely Christian nationalists. That's, I think, where I would start in terms of this work in particular. I think, as I described in the beginning, they're quite a range. There's quite a range in this field. It is ever evolving. They might still have a Christian soft spot, but it is too big to pinpoint as just this category of people. I think when I'm citing sociologists of religion, I'm thinking about how so much of this scholarship is so America-centric. And I think that's part of the motivation in the way that I frame this talk, is to say sociologists of religion have quite a lot to learn from interdisciplinary scholarship that has done a much, much better job in stepping outside of the US. So I think even, and so that I think that's what I'm thinking is so much, or that's part of this argument, right? Is to say even when Christian nationalists are evoking the sense of eternal persecution, even like the example of Eric Metaxas and the Capitol insurrection, there's a way that you can understand these as just domestic anxieties, but I think there's a very critical element to understand this as a transnational process. So I think that's part of the really wishing sociology of religion would step out, and some of this literature would step out to consider either global manifestations of religious nationalism, which I think some of these scholars are doing, or to understand some domestic anxieties and constructions and even articulations of Christian nationalism as something that's a bit transnational. Yes, I'll stop there. It's not my area of expertise, but that's kind of why I frame some of this project that way, is that it's too US-centric.
Yeah. No, I see that. I can really see that through the talk, through what you were saying. The other question I had before we move on to others was, now that you've been in Toronto for a year or so, do you kind of see this use of the Christian persecution influenced by transnational dynamics influencing political gain in Canada at all? Is that something that you've seen on this side of the northern border, or not so much? Or are you? What's the
I'm looking at my phone because I pulled out my notes, anticipating that question.
There you go.
So I'm not familiar or immersed, and it's totally my fault in Canadian politics today. But I do recall that there were various ways in which there's various incidents in Canada where you saw some of this, where you saw people evoking this, the sense of Christian persecution. So I vaguely remember during the trucker protests that people were singing hymns about martyrdom during these protests. So that too is evoking a sense of persecution. I also somewhat vaguely remember that when there was a series of arsons against Catholic churches, one of them was, one of the churches attacked was a Coptic Orthodox church. And then too, Copts really mobilized around a sense of persecution at home and here. Again, I'm not too familiar with the extent in which this impacts politics or in which this is evoked in a political context. But these narratives, I have at least seen examples of it here too.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Jeremy, that's the next.
Fascinating, by the way. Thank you very much. And I should also say, I read one of your articles that was available where you really go into some of the internal dynamics within the Coptic community, which is fascinating because I really think that some of those, I mean, I'm coming out of a Christian theological framework, and so what in some ways was almost most interesting to me is how any given tradition is sort of wrestling with internal diversity as they're trying to navigate. But actually, I think that my question, I think I will sort of maybe build on Galen's in terms of one of the things that one of the ways that I've come to some of this story, and I'm coming very much as an outsider in terms of the 21 Libyan martyrs, for example, is for a project on martyrdom and ecumenism, martyrdom and the unity of the church. So one of the frames that come to mind is like the relatively recent decision of Pope Francis to officially recognize these martyrs who are not in communion with the Catholic Church as Catholic martyrs, which is remarkable and almost unprecedented. And so that is a framework of this sort of transnational unity. I mean, there is certainly the persecution of Christians narrative that's a part of, but it doesn't have the Christian nationalism dimension, at least not in the way that American sort of discourse does. And so because of course the other sort of aspect of that sort of transnational kind of ecumenism of martyrdom brings in people like Archbishop Oscar Romero, who is a sort of a hero of resistance to authoritarian states, a Catholic martyr, officially recognized and so on, but very much a resource for those who are sort of combating authoritarianism. Of course, as you evoke Eric Metaxas and his work on Bonhoeffer, which is a fascinating kind of story. I think where all of this is sort of going here is just this category of martyrdom, which can just take so many forms. And I was especially intrigued by your concept of abstracted atrocity. Because, and I'd be interested in you saying more about that, or even like abstracted martyrdom. I mean, the case of Bonhoeffer, and I don't mean to get into another case, other than it seems like a case like Bonhoeffer, which I'm a bit more familiar with, can almost be used for anyone on the political spectrum, which is kind of remarkable. And I'm curious, again, if how these particular 21 martyrs are they used by sort of a range of people on a political spectrum in a way that Bonhoeffer can be a hero of even a secular left as well as an activist Christian left, as well as the January 6th rioters. Anyways,
I think
a
that-
long
I think
preamble
the
there, but
question-
interested in that.
Yeah, no, I think that's fascinating. My instinct is to feel like the 21 martyrs cannot be used across the political spectrum, primarily because that story is embroiled in the politics of the war on terror. And I say that, and then I'll backtrack in a second. But initially, so when the 21 martyrs happened, President Obama, I think, gave a statement in which he said that the perpetrators were not. No, in which he said that the victims were not Christians but Egyptians. And then, yes, I think I'm trying to remember if he also said that ISIS were not a representation of Islam, but I can't quite remember. But I think the controversy was around the fact that he refused to recognize them as Christians but Egyptians, which, okay. And may be used across the political spectrum.
I don't mean that they should be, but I'm just.
No, I'm kind of thinking through that. Yeah, so my instinct was to be like, no, well, the politics of terror, the war on terror implicates it into, you know, and so initially I was going to say it means that, you know, there's a framing of religion, Muslims versus Christians. There's a sense that you're, you know, talking about terrorism, which in a U.S. context, in a context in which Islamophobia is very rampant and people are fearful of reducing Islam to terrorism. So in adopting that discourse, initially I was going to say is very much a discourse that unfolds within a conservative circle, a circle that is ready to demonize Muslims. And so then the 21 become a quintessential example. Then I backtracked a little bit because the war on terror is not a conservative war, as in the US. It's not one that's advanced by the Republican Party. It's one that's advanced by both, and Obama played a really big role. But when progressives do draw on this, they'll then, I think to your point, when they do, so like Obama did, when they do draw on these examples, they change the categorization of these victims from Christians to Egyptians, or from religious freedom to human rights. And so the framing changes entirely. The way then you come to understand these not as martyrs, but as, I don't know, victims of political violence or victims of authoritarian neglect or etc., changes the framework entirely. This is not embedded in the logic of martyrdom, but the way martyrdom is evoked by the Coptic Church, by the Egyptian government, by the American religious right, which are its key advocates, is embroiled in a conservative politics. And this does say something about the way the war on terror shapes these narratives and the way the war on terror vilifies Muslims. Maybe it's an unconvincing answer, but I'll think through that a bit more. But that's, I think, my instinct is to feel like it cannot be so universal in that way, but still I'm hesitant, I think. Yeah, I'll think more, but yeah. Or I'm curious to hear your thoughts too.
Okay, and maybe one last question from Caroline.
Yeah, lots of thought-provoking stuff in this talk, so thank you. This is actually also a across the political spectrum kind of question, but maybe more general. And it comes, I think, from my dual life as a sociologist of religion and academic administrator. And in the academic administrator side of things, I would go to like a Catholic presidents and provost conference in the US and hear US Catholic university presidents say things like, with all of the threats to EDI in states across the US, our best hope of protecting those positions and commitments is to start loudly and clearly making the argument that it's a religious freedom issue, that it's actually central to Catholic social teaching to be able to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion. And there's the sense, particularly with electoral change, that religious freedom might be a better and more convincing argument to one side of the political spectrum, even though the positions on EDI are on the other side of the political spectrum. And that made me want to ask you the question, like, in your kind of context, what does this case maybe teach us about, like, how religious does religious freedom have to be, if that makes sense, right? Like, there's a version of religious freedom that's like protecting people who are deeply practicing, very active, strong identities, to the point of martyrdom. And then there's another version that it's like, you know, you can sort of be like, maybe like as vaguely religious as a university, you know, and I'm kind of curious if there's something in your research that sort of says, how religious do you have to be for a religious freedom argument to be compelling?
There's a set of scholars who say religious freedom is impossible because religion is not defined, mainly not defined legally. And the set of scholars, I think, will, for example, talk about how ideas about religious freedom are rooted in Protestant ideas, how that then becomes exclusionary of certain groups who might practice or believe in ways that are not cannot be understood as mainstream religion. So how religious? So I don't know that it's so much about how religious you are. But there's a way that religious freedom in the US privileges, I think, certain kinds of religions. But there's a way that religious freedom, I think, can just be leveraged as a political tool, I think, in the example that you're giving too. That it becomes, I think, for so many of these advocates, in my context, but I think for maybe your context of a university, that there's a way that the framing you use isn't inherent to the problem you're facing, but the framing you use you use it because it's effective. So Copts come to the US and start adopting this language of religious freedom, though in Egypt, the discourse is around minority rights. So they come to the US and adopt this language of religious freedom because it's readily available and it's powerful because Republicans have been mobilizing it around it for quite some time. There's currency, political currency. I think in that way, I don't know that it's so much about religion or even defining religion for these scholars who say it's cannot be defined. And I see it, I think, through my work as a political strategy. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Well, I'd like to thank Miray once more. Thanks so much, Miray. And yeah, thanks everyone online for being here. Thanks for being here in person. Those for in person, we will probably go for a coffee after. So you're welcome to join us and keep the conversation going on. Please do. And yeah. Carol. Thank you, Tyler. Thanks, all right.
Take care of
I'll take some mic off.
Oh, yes.